It was August 1945. The war in the Pacific was ending, and the world was standing at the edge of a new chapter in history. On small islands scattered across the vast blue ocean, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, once proud, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, were now prisoners of the U.S. Army. But what truly stunned them wasn't defeat. It wasn't even the unimaginable power of the American military machine. What left them speechless was the sight of women driving military jeeps, issuing commands, and wearing the uniform of victory. These were the women of the United States Army, nurses, mechanics, clerks, and drivers, serving their nation with pride and precision. To the captured Japanese soldiers, raised in a society where women were rarely seen in positions of power, this was something beyond imagination. The date is August 20, 1945. On the island of Okinawa, the air still smells of salt and smoke. The U.S. Army is busy rebuilding order. Across the dusty airfields, long convoys of jeeps and trucks move in perfect formation. At the wheel of many of these vehicles are American women in olive drab uniforms, confident, calm, and unafraid. A Japanese lieutenant, barely 23 years old, stands behind the barbed wire fence of a prisoner camp. His eyes follow a young American woman as she steps out of her jeep and gives instructions to a group of soldiers unloading medical supplies. She moves with certainty, her tone clear, her presence commanding. The lieutenant looks at his fellow prisoners in disbelief. To them, this scene feels like watching another planet come alive. The U.S. Army's presence in the Pacific wasn't just military, it was transformational. Every soldier, male or female, embodied the spirit of democracy, equality, and resilience that defined America. While the world burned, the United States showed that power wasn't just about weapons, it was about values. Women in uniform had become the symbol of that strength. The Women's Army Corps, known as the WAC, had been formed in 1942. Over 150,000 American women served in it during the war. They drove trucks across dangerous terrain, repaired airplanes, decoded secret messages, and worked in hospitals that saved thousands of lives. To the Japanese prisoners of war who came from a society built on hierarchy and male dominance, seeing women in authority was not only strange, it was revolutionary. One former Japanese soldier later recalled, "We could not understand it. These women spoke to men like equals. They gave orders and men followed. We had never seen such a thing." For the U.S. Army, this was proof of something far greater than victory, it was a glimpse of the future. America's war machine wasn't powered by conquest, it was powered by belief. Belief that every person, regardless of gender, had the right to serve, to lead, and to be respected. Even General Douglas MacArthur, leading U.S. forces in the Pacific, often spoke of the courage of the women who stood behind the front lines. Their work made victory possible. They typed the reports, manned the radios, and nursed the wounded back to life. In many ways, they were the heartbeat of the American military effort. By late August 1945, as camps were set up to process the surrendering Japanese forces, more women in uniform arrived, some driving Red Cross vehicles, others working as translators or medical aides. For the POWs, every encounter was a lesson in humility. They had been told America was a nation of luxury and weakness. Instead, they found discipline, compassion, and a kind of strength they couldn't comprehend. One particularly vivid memory spread through the POW camps. A young American woman driving a jeep through the mud, laughing as she splashed through puddles while soldiers saluted her in respect. To the prisoners, that moment shattered everything they thought they knew about the world. The U.S. Army had shown them a new definition of power, one built not on fear but on freedom. And as the sun set over the Pacific that August evening, the prisoners began to understand. The America that defeated them wasn't just a country, it was an idea. September 2, 1945. The gray morning sky above Tokyo Bay hangs heavy with history. The war is over. On the deck of the USS Missouri, Japan signs the instrument of surrender. Cameras flash. Pens scratch. And for the first time in generations, the Japanese Empire bows to another power. But for the soldiers and civilians back home, the real shock isn't just defeat, it's what comes after. As the first waves of U.S. Army personnel march through the ruins of Yokohama and Tokyo, the Japanese people watch from the sidewalks in silence. Then out of the dust and chaos come the jeeps. And behind the wheels of those jeeps, women. American women in crisp khaki uniforms. Their faces calm, their posture firm. They drive through streets where buildings lie in rubble and children stare wide-eyed. To the people of Japan, the image feels like a vision from another world. Women commanding vehicles once built for war, moving with the same authority as men. Inside one of the jeeps, a WAC sergeant named Margaret Hill grips the steering wheel. She's 26 years old, from Kansas. 2 years earlier she was typing supply orders in a Washington office. Now she's driving through what was once enemy territory, carrying medical kits and rations for U.S. Army hospitals. When Japanese onlookers meet her eyes, they don't see arrogance, they see purpose. For the U.S. Army, the occupation isn't just about control, it's about rebuilding a nation. American soldiers share food with hungry children, reopen schools, and repair bridges. And alongside them, American women help run the communication centers, the hospitals, the offices that keep everything moving. They show a defeated nation that discipline and compassion can exist together. In one camp near Yokosuka, Japanese prisoners of war are put to work cleaning and sorting supplies. One afternoon, a convoy of jeeps arrives, led by a woman lieutenant. She steps out, checks the inventory, and starts giving orders. Her tone is confident, her voice calm, and every man listens. Some stare in disbelief. Others whisper to each other. But all obey. It's a scene repeated across Japan in the months following surrender. The U.S. Army, efficient, respectful, and fair, becomes a living example of democracy in action. And those women, whether they're driving jeeps or running field offices, become the face of that new kind of power. A Japanese interpreter later remembered, "They were kind but firm. We had never seen women behave like that. It was as if they carried the strength of America itself." As General MacArthur establishes his headquarters in Tokyo, American women are present everywhere, typing reports, filing logistics data, managing radio transmissions. Their work keeps the gears of occupation turning smoothly. Every coded message, every shipment of supplies, every rebuilt road passes through their capable hands. The U.S. Army treats them with the same respect as their male counterparts, something astonishing to many Japanese observers. To them, it's as though America has turned the entire social order upside down, and yet it works perfectly. Meanwhile, American media photographers document the transformation. Newspapers back home publish photos of smiling WACs helping Japanese nurses in hospitals, or women soldiers shaking hands with curious local children. The images reach across the world, symbolizing not domination but unity. For the Japanese POWs still held on smaller islands, word spreads quickly. They hear stories of American women walking freely through Tokyo, commanding soldiers, even speaking directly with generals. Many refuse to believe it. How could a nation allow such freedom, and still be so powerful? That question becomes one of the defining lessons of the post-war years. America's strength, they realize, comes not from hierarchy but from opportunity. The U.S. Army, with its unmatched discipline and humanity, demonstrates a truth that will echo across decades. A nation that respects all its citizens, men and women alike, can achieve the impossible. By the end of 1945, over 350,000 American women have served in uniform. They've proven that courage has no gender. And for every Japanese prisoner who once doubted it, the sight of a woman driving a U.S. Army Jeep through the streets of Tokyo is a memory they will never forget. It is the dawn of a new era, not just for Japan but for the world. January 1946. The bitter winter winds cut through the streets of Tokyo. The once mighty capital of an empire lies quiet beneath a pale sky. Buildings stand shattered, rail lines twisted like broken bones, and smoke drifts from makeshift stoves where families huddle for warmth. But through the ruins moves something extraordinary, the rhythmic hum of U.S. Army vehicles, the clang of construction, the sound of laughter where there was once silence. The occupation has turned from control to compassion. And at the center of it all stands the U.S. Army, rebuilding not only a country but an entire way of thinking. In the corridors of the newly established General Headquarters, young American women type reports, process requests, and manage the logistics of a nation's rebirth. They are the backbone of MacArthur's vision, efficiency with empathy. Every letter they send, every order they stamp, carries the weight of America's promise to Japan, that from the ashes democracy will rise. Outside, on the streets of Ginza, American jeeps roll past crowds of Japanese civilians. One jeep stops near a school where U.S. Army engineers are repairing the roof. Behind the wheel sits Sergeant Clara Moore, a communications officer from Chicago. As she steps out, local children run toward her, fascinated by her uniform and bright smile. She kneels down, handing out chocolate bars and crayons, small gifts that speak louder than any speech could. For the Japanese who had lived under years of rigid hierarchy, this kind of humanity from a soldier, especially a woman, feels almost unreal. The contrast is staggering. Here is a foreign army powerful enough to destroy cities, yet gentle enough to rebuild schools and feed the hungry. And the most remarkable part? The same women driving military jeeps by day were often teaching English or helping with local clinics by night. They were ambassadors of a new kind of strength, not built on fear but on freedom. One Japanese schoolteacher later wrote in her diary, "They came not as conquerors but as teachers." The women smiled. They drove their jeeps with confidence. We had never seen such things before. They were soldiers, yet they were kind. The U.S. Army, through its discipline and humanity, was showing Japan what democracy looked like in action. Every jeep driven by a woman, every classroom repaired, every hospital supplied by American hands was a living lesson in equality and respect. In early 1946, when food shortages hit Tokyo, it was U.S. Army logistics, many of them coordinated by female officers, that kept hundreds of thousands from starvation. They managed supply routes, ration distributions, and communication lines that spanned thousands of miles. To the Japanese people, it was nothing short of miraculous. Even Japanese officers who had once fought against America began to admire the efficiency and fairness of their captors. They were treated with dignity. The guards were firm but never cruel. One former officer remembered how a young American woman, overseeing logistics at a POW camp, corrected a male soldier who spoke harshly to a prisoner. She had authority, he recalled. Her words carried weight. The men respected her. And so did we. By mid-1946, Japanese newspapers, now free from censorship, began publishing articles about the American occupation. One headline read, "The New Faces of Power." The story featured photographs of women in uniform, typing reports, driving jeeps, standing beside American generals. The tone was one of awe and curiosity. How could a country that allowed women to lead also build the most powerful army on earth? The answer was clear in every action of the U.S. Army. America's strength came not from domination but from unity. It came from the belief that freedom, fairness, and opportunity were worth defending. And slowly that belief began to take root in Japan itself. As winter melted into spring, the streets of Tokyo began to fill with color again. Markets reopened. Schools buzzed with laughter. And every morning the rumble of U.S. Army jeeps echoed through the city, symbols of order, safety, and progress. For the Japanese people, especially the young, those women in olive uniforms became icons of a new era, proof that courage wears many faces. And for the prisoners of war still watching from behind fences, the lesson was humbling and unforgettable. America had defeated them not just with might but with morals. April 1946. Cherry blossoms bloom again in Tokyo. For the first time in years, the streets are alive with color and laughter. The sound of hammers and saws replaces the echo of air raid sirens. The war is gone, but the lessons it left behind are just beginning to shape a new Japan. Inside the Daiichi building, overlooking the Imperial Palace, the U.S. Army's general headquarters hums with energy. Telephones ring, typewriters clack, and the sound of boots echoes across polished floors. It is here that General Douglas MacArthur and his team, including dozens of brilliant American women, are rewriting the very foundation of Japan. Among them is a 29-year-old legal secretary named Beat Sirota Gordon. Fluent in Japanese and passionate about human rights, she works side by side with U.S. military officers drafting what will become Japan's new constitution. She's not a soldier, but her courage is unmistakable. And when she proposes the revolutionary idea of gender equality, giving Japanese women the right to vote, to work, and to be treated as equals, even the senior officers pause in awe. Her words, backed by the moral authority of the U.S. Army, make history. Article 14 of the new Japanese Constitution will later read, "All of the people are equal under the law and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of sex." It is a sentence that changes the destiny of millions, and it comes directly from the American belief that freedom belongs to everyone. Outside the walls of government, that belief takes visible form. American women in uniform continue to drive jeeps through the narrow streets, coordinate aid programs, and train local workers. They help rebuild hospitals, reopen post offices, and distribute textbooks to newly reopened schools. Every act, every gesture reinforces a message that Japan will never forget. The United States conquers through compassion. For Japanese women, seeing their American counterparts in positions of command is nothing short of a revelation. For generations they had been told their place was in the home, silent and obedient. Now before their eyes stand women who issue orders to soldiers, operate machinery, and hold meetings with generals. In Osaka, A group of Japanese nurses attend a training session run by the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Their instructor, Captain Ruth Houghton, demonstrates emergency field care with precision and authority. When a Japanese officer hesitates to take her direction, she calmly insists, "You can do this, but you'll do it right." Her tone is firm but respectful, and within minutes, everyone is following her lead. By the end of the day, the Japanese staff bow deeply in gratitude. The story spreads quickly, not just about Captain Houghton but about the way the U.S. Army operates. Order, respect, fairness. These are not just military rules, they are moral codes. Meanwhile, in the rural towns outside Tokyo, American soldiers and Japanese villagers work side by side to rebuild bridges and roads destroyed during the war. Jeep convoys deliver supplies, often driven by American women who wave and smile at curious children. These simple gestures become powerful symbols of hope. To the Japanese who once believed the U.S. Army to be an unstoppable force of destruction, the transformation is overwhelming. The very soldiers who conquered their empire are now rebuilding it, and doing so with dignity and kindness. By late 1946, Japan holds its first democratic elections under U.S. supervision. And for the first time in the nation's history, women stand in line to vote. American officers, both men and women, watch with pride as Japanese citizens, young and old, place their ballots in the boxes. It is a quiet revolution born not from violence, but from the ideals the U.S. Army carried across the Pacific. General MacArthur himself later writes that the American women who served during the occupation were the silent architects of peace. Their discipline, intelligence, and compassion helped shape a society that would rise stronger than ever before. Even the former prisoners of war, still confined in camps but gradually being released, hear of these changes. They learn that the new Japanese constitution guarantees equality for women, that schools are teaching democracy, and that American soldiers treat civilians with respect. Many are stunned. "The Americans," one prisoner writes in his diary, "have won not only the war but the hearts of our people." By early 1947, Japan is no longer the defeated empire of old. It is a nation in recovery, its spirit renewed by the very army that once stood against it. And through every act of rebuilding, the U.S. Army proves again that real strength isn't about conquering land, but about lifting humanity. The women driving those jeeps, giving orders and carrying clipboards in rebuilt offices were not just soldiers, they were symbols of the future. A future built by America. Spring 1947. Tokyo's skyline still carries the scars of war, but beneath the cracks, something new is taking root: friendship. In the busy intersections of Ginza, American soldiers walk side by side with Japanese civilians. Children wave at passing military jeeps. Market stalls once abandoned are open again, selling rice, books, and hope. And amidst the crowd, you can still spot the olive-drab uniforms of U.S. Army women, driving trucks, taking notes, and greeting locals with confident smiles. What began as an occupation has turned into an education, not just for the Japanese but for the Americans too. At the 8th Army headquarters in Yokohama, Corporal Evelyn Parker, a 24-year-old driver from Ohio, has become something of a local celebrity. Every morning she drives her Jeep through the same market street to deliver mail and supplies. At first, people stared in silence. A woman in uniform commanding a U.S. Army vehicle? But soon they began to wave. Some bowed. And one elderly shopkeeper, a former soldier himself, began leaving her small origami cranes as gifts of respect. "Every time I drove by," she would later recall, "he would salute. Not out of fear but out of understanding. He respected what we stood for." Across Japan, scenes like this unfold daily. U.S. Army women become teachers, mentors, and living examples of what equality looks like in action. Japanese women, inspired by their confidence, begin joining community groups, volunteering in hospitals, and even applying for government jobs. In Nagoya, a group of Japanese university students form an English club with help from a WAC sergeant named Helen Moore. She teaches them conversation, but what truly amazes them is how freely she speaks her mind. One student writes in his diary, "She looks us in the eye. She talks as if we are equals. In her, I see the spirit of her country." For the U.S. Army, these moments aren't just goodwill gestures, they're part of a larger mission. America isn't just rebuilding Japan's cities, it's rebuilding its soul. The idea is simple but revolutionary: show the people of Japan that freedom, when guided by discipline and respect, creates strength greater than any empire. By now, many Japanese prisoners of war have been repatriated from islands across the Pacific. They return home to a nation unrecognizable from the one they left. Instead of anger and bitterness, they find streets buzzing with energy and American soldiers working side by side with civilians. They hear their sisters and mothers speaking of women's rights, fair wages, and elections. They see American women driving jeeps and realize that the world has changed, and so must they. One returning officer confides to a friend, "We thought America would humiliate us. Instead they taught us." Meanwhile, back in the POW camps still operating in the Philippines and the Marianas, stories of America's fairness continue to spread. Japanese prisoners are amazed that their captors feed them well, treat them with dignity, and allow medical care, all organized under the supervision of U.S. Army nurses and female officers. They cannot reconcile what they were told about America with what they now experience. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, an American camp officer, once wrote in his journal, "Some of these men have never taken orders from a woman in their entire lives. But when a U.S. Army nurse gives an instruction they follow. Not because they're forced to, but because they trust her." That trust becomes one of America's greatest victories. By 1948, Japanese newspapers are filled with stories of cooperation and recovery. Articles praise the efficiency of U.S. supply chains, the fairness of rationing systems, and the kindness of American soldiers. Photographs show female clerks, drivers, and nurses smiling beside Japanese civilians, a quiet reminder that war can end, but humanity must continue. Even Japanese film studios, newly reopened with U.S. support, begin depicting women differently, not as silent figures, but as active participants in society. The influence of the American women they saw in jeeps and uniforms becomes part of Japan's new cultural identity. And through it all, the U.S. Army continues to operate with precision and pride. The soldiers remain disciplined, the aid flows efficiently, and the moral tone never wavers. Every convoy, every rebuilt road, every handshake reminds the world why the United States stands as a beacon of freedom. When asked years later what impressed him most about the occupation, a former Japanese general simply said, "The Americans did not just win with bombs. They won with their hearts. And they sent women to show us what freedom truly meant." By the end of 1948, the last of the major POW camps are closing, and Japan's recovery is in full motion. But for many of those former prisoners, and the civilians who witnessed it, one image remains forever etched in memory. A woman in U.S. Army uniform, driving a military jeep down a rebuilt Tokyo street, wind in her hair, purpose in her eyes. The symbol of a nation that conquered not through fear, but through freedom. Summer, 1948. Japan is reborn. The cities, once covered in ash, now glow with new light. The scent of rebuilding, sawdust, concrete, fresh ink, fills the air. And everywhere, the stars and stripes wave alongside the rising sun. The partnership that began with surrender has become a shared mission for the future. At the center of this transformation stands the U.S. Army, a force not just of might but of meaning. Its soldiers, engineers, doctors, and teachers are working to create a Japan that will never again be ruled by fear. And among them, once again, are the women who continue to amaze the world, and the Japanese people most of all. At the Tokyo Education Bureau, a group of U.S. Army officers meet with Japanese officials to discuss curriculum reform. Leading the session is Lieutenant N. Rogers, a 32-year-old officer from California, fluent in Japanese and passionate about teaching democracy. She stands before a room of male professors, explaining how the new system will encourage free thinking and equal opportunity. The professors listen intently, taking notes. Some are skeptical. But as the discussion continues, they begin to see the logic in her calm, methodical tone. She speaks not with authority alone, but with conviction. When she concludes her presentation, one elderly professor stands and bows deeply. "Your army," he says, "teaches not how to destroy but how to build." Outside the meeting halls, young Japanese students experience the same awakening. Schools rebuilt with U.S. Army assistance now have new textbooks, printed with the help of American technicians, that teach not only math and science, but also civics, fairness, and cooperation. In classrooms across the nation, Japanese children recite new lessons about democracy, respect, and peace. And sometimes those lessons are delivered directly by American women. In one school in Kyoto, an American Red Cross officer named Mary Collins visits weekly to teach English and distribute supplies. The children adore her. They call her Sensei Mary. Her Jeep, decorated with colorful stickers from her home state of Texas, becomes a symbol of excitement and hope. When she parks outside the schoolyard, even passing adults stop to stare. The sight of a woman soldier, cheerful and self-assured, driving through post-war Japan seems almost like magic, a small but powerful glimpse of the world beyond the ruins. The U.S. Army's influence reaches far beyond classrooms. Through the Civil Information and Education section, many of whose staff are women, the Army sponsors radio broadcasts, public talks, and community meetings to teach the principles of democracy. They encourage open debate, free press, and the idea that every citizen, man or woman, has a voice. To a nation that once believed obedience was strength, this message feels radical. But it works. One Japanese journalist writes in his newspaper column, "The Americans defeated us with their machines, but they saved us with their ideas." Meanwhile, the former prisoners of war, men who once marched under the empire's flag, return home to find their wives and daughters speaking with newfound confidence. Some are surprised, others are proud. Slowly, they begin to realize that America's power lies not in hierarchy but in harmony. One ex-officer, now a teacher in Sapporo, tells his students, "I learned something behind barbed wire. The Americans obey orders, yes, but they obey them because they believe in them. Their women drive jeeps not because they must but because they can. That is freedom." His words echo across the years. By 1949, Japan's transformation is astonishing the world. Newspapers in the United States praise the U.S. Army for its humanitarian victory. General MacArthur himself calls the occupation a great experiment in democracy. And central to that success are the women whose service proved that compassion can be stronger than fear. They continue to serve, driving jeeps through mountain passes, delivering mail, inspecting hospitals, and advising Japanese officials. Wherever they go, they carry the same quiet authority that once stunned the POWs. Discipline without cruelty, command without arrogance. Even Japanese filmmakers begin capturing this change. In post-war cinema, new female characters appear: doctors, reporters, teachers, inspired by the American women they saw in uniform. And in homes across Japan, little girls begin dreaming not of servitude, but of service. As the 1950s dawn, the occupation nears its end. American troops prepare to return home, their mission accomplished. Japan stands on its own again, democratic, stable, and free. Yet for millions of Japanese citizens, the memories of those years will never fade. The sound of a Jeep engine, the sight of an American woman saluting a general, the warmth of a chocolate bar shared with a child. The U.S. Army had done more than rebuild a country. It had rebuilt faith in humanity. And for the Japanese prisoners who once stared in disbelief at those women driving jeeps, one truth became undeniable. They had witnessed the power of America, a power not of domination but of dignity. Spring 1951. 6 years have passed since the guns fell silent. Japan, once a land of ashes, now hums with the rhythm of renewal. Neon lights begin to return to Tokyo's skyline. Factories roar back to life. Schools overflow with eager students. And everywhere, the spirit of freedom breathes through the streets. The U.S. Army, still stationed across the islands, no longer looks like an occupying force. They are now protectors, partners, and friends. And among their ranks, the same women who once stunned the world continue to serve, their uniforms slightly faded, their resolve brighter than ever. In Yokohama Harbor, a group of American women disembark from a supply ship. They wear WAC patches on their sleeves, their boots dusty from travel. Some are new arrivals, others veterans of the long occupation. Japanese dockworkers nod respectfully as they pass. Where once there was silence or suspicion, there is now admiration. Nearby, a small boy runs alongside a U.S. Army Jeep, waving as it drives past. The woman behind the wheel, Lieutenant Patricia Lane, honks the horn and smiles. She's become a familiar face in the city, known for her tireless work organizing relief shipments for rural schools. To the locals, she's more than a soldier, she's a friend. The sight of women driving jeeps, commanding men, and leading operations no longer shocks the Japanese. It inspires them. In universities, young women study political science and medicine, motivated by what they've witnessed. In newspapers, editorials praise the American spirit that turned destruction into democracy. And for the former prisoners of war, many of whom have now reintegrated into society, the memories of their captivity under American watch still echo. They remember the discipline, the fairness, the kindness that defied everything they had been taught about war. Some of them now teach their children that the true strength of America lies not in its weapons, but in its values. In the spring of 1951, Japan signs the San Francisco Peace Treaty, formally ending the state of war and restoring its sovereignty. On that day in Tokyo's U.S. Army headquarters, officers and civilians, American and Japanese alike, gather to celebrate. Among them are several women of the Women's Army Corps, who have spent nearly a decade shaping Japan's future from behind desks, wheels, and hospital beds. When the flag of Japan is raised beside the flag of the United States, the applause fills the hall. A Japanese reporter notes in his article the next morning, "They came as conquerors and stayed as teachers. Their women showed us the strength of equality. Their soldiers showed us the meaning of honor." In the years that follow, the bond between the two nations grows stronger. American military advisors help Japan rebuild its defense forces, while Japanese engineers learn modern technology from U.S. instructors. The same U.S. Army that once fought on these shores now trains Japanese soldiers, not for war but for peace. And through it all, those American women continue to play a quiet but crucial role. Many stay behind to work in embassies, hospitals, and relief agencies. Some marry Japanese men and start families, becoming living bridges between two cultures that once stood oceans apart in spirit. In Tokyo, one former POW named Kenji Takada opens a small bookstore. On the counter he keeps a framed photo, a young American woman standing beside a jeep, smiling. When asked who she was, he always replies the same way. "She was the first American I ever respected. She taught me that strength and kindness can live in the same heart." Across Japan, stories like his are countless. The image of the American woman in uniform, confident, capable, and compassionate, becomes a lasting symbol of the country's transformation. She is not just a driver or a clerk or a nurse. She is the face of a new kind of power, one that inspires instead of intimidates. By 1952, as the last U.S. occupation forces begin to withdraw, the legacy they leave behind is visible everywhere. Girls attend universities once closed to them. Newspapers speak freely. Elections are open. Japan stands tall again, not as a conquered nation, but as an ally of the very army that once brought it to its knees. And in the quiet moments before their departure, some of those American women drive their jeeps through the rebuilt streets one last time. Children wave. Shopkeepers bow. Soldiers salute. The sound of the engines fades into the warm Tokyo night, a reminder of how far both nations have come. From war to friendship, from defeat to dignity, the journey was written not just by generals and politicians, but by ordinary soldiers who carried extraordinary ideals. And when the Japanese people looked into the eyes of those American women, they saw something they would never forget. The true power of the United States Army, courage guided by compassion. Autumn 1952. The air in Tokyo is crisp and quiet. The occupation is officially over. U.S. Army convoys rumble through the streets one final time, their tires kicking up the dust of a nation reborn. Flags wave from rooftops, the red sun of Japan and the stars and stripes of the United States, two symbols that once clashed, now flying side by side. From the balconies, Japanese citizens watch the departing troops with a mix of gratitude and awe. The children who once hid from bombers now chase after jeeps, laughing. The soldiers smile, wave, and toss candy into the crowd. And among them, driving one of the final departing vehicles, is a woman. Her name is Captain Margaret Hill, the same young officer who once landed in Okinawa in 1945, whose presence had stunned the Japanese POWs then. Now, 7 years later, she drives past those same faces, not as a conqueror but as a friend. The world has changed. And she, like the country around her, carries the proof that compassion can rebuild what war destroys. Historians would later call the U.S. occupation of Japan the most successful reconstruction in modern history. But behind that success were people, ordinary Americans in uniform who brought discipline, decency, and democracy wherever they went. And among them, the women of the U.S. Army left one of the deepest marks of all. When the Japanese prisoners of war first saw those women driving jeeps, giving orders and saluting generals, they were not just shocked, they were transformed. To men raised in a culture of strict hierarchy, it was as if they were witnessing the future unfold before their eyes. They began to understand that America's strength didn't come from dominance, it came from dignity. Decades later, former POWs would still recall those moments. "I could not believe it," said one in a 1980 interview. "She drove the jeep as if she owned the world." And in a way she did. Because she believed in something greater than fear. Another recalled, "We thought they were strange at first. But we saw how they worked, how they treated us, how they respected everyone. That changed everything. They showed us that kindness and power can live together." Across Japan, memories of those years lingered in the stories passed down from parents to children. The women who had once been symbols of defeat became symbols of respect, hope, and change. Japanese schoolbooks began including lessons about democracy and equality, ideas that grew from that very occupation. In the decades that followed, Japan would rise from ruin to become one of the world's greatest democracies, a nation built on peace, innovation, and partnership with the very country that once fought against it. And at the heart of that miracle was the quiet influence of the U.S. Army's values, the discipline of its soldiers, the compassion of its leaders, and the courage of its women. As the Cold War began to shape the global stage, Japan stood firmly beside the United States, not because it had to, but because it chose to. The friendship between the two nations became unbreakable, forged in respect and born from understanding. At military reunions decades later, Japanese veterans and American officers would meet again, not as enemies but as old comrades in peace. Some would bring faded photographs, a jeep parked on a muddy road, an American nurse smiling beside Japanese children, a group of POWs saluting an American officer who treated them with honor. Those images, preserved in albums and memories, tell the story of a miracle that no bullet could ever achieve, the triumph of humanity over hatred. In one museum in Okinawa, a small plaque stands beside a black and white photo of an American woman behind the wheel of a jeep. The inscription reads, "She drove through the ruins of war, carrying the spirit of freedom." That single line captures the heart of it all. The story of the Japanese POWs and the women of the U.S. Army is not just about victory in battle. It's about victory in values. It's about a country that showed the world that real power doesn't destroy, it rebuilds. And as the final shots of the documentary fade, the narration continues over images of rebuilt Japan, glowing cities, peaceful harbors, children laughing under cherry blossoms. The United States Army did more than win a war. It built a peace that endures to this day. And in the eyes of those who once saw them as enemies, the women who drove those jeeps became living proof of America's greatest strength, the freedom to believe, to rebuild, and to lead with honor. The camera pans upward, the American and Japanese flags waving together in the morning light. The music swells.